Welcome to Building Bigger Lives. Today, I'm kind of something fun and out of the box is what we're up to, and we are doing a book club. There is a book that Michael introduced me to a little bit ago, and we've talked a lot about how to bring books into the podcast. And so we're going to test this out and see how it goes. And today we're going to talk about Boys in the Boat, which is now a movie, but originally was a book. And that's really when you fell in love with a book and have learned lots of lessons from it. So we're going to go through some of those today with everybody on the podcast. So, Michael, tell me a little bit about how you found the book and why you've really been digging into it for many, many years.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it really was one of those books that expanded my thinking and became part of my coaching arsenal. And I believe it was back in 2015 when I had been invited with Bill Hart to lead the Master's Coach program at Building Champions, which was a unique group of professionals from the mortgage lending industry that were a bunch of high performance leaders, both in the production side and in the executive management side of the business. And Todd Mosetter from our team came back and said, hey, this book is chock full of excellent leadership application. But because it's a story, I think we can get people to really engage it, and we can even do some exercises around it. So that was back in 2015 when I first read the book and was introduced, and immediately saw that the book, like he said, had all kinds of application. The one that stands out to me, Catherine, the one I would probably build any discussion around was the theme that became my filter for almost everything as I work with high performance teams. And it's the theme they grabbed in the story about, will this make the boat go faster? Will this make the boat go faster? So every decision they made as a team was around that thought, whether it was the human beings they put in the boat, the equipment they used, the type of gear that they wore, on and on and on. It was always built around that filter. And I find when I'm working with teams, that becomes a very simplifying focal point when I can get them to realize that all of this fun stuff that we do as a team can be entertaining and maybe even motivating at some level. But does it make the boat go faster? So depending upon your business model, it could be, does this help you sell more houses? Does this help you get more listings? Does this help you lock more loans? Whatever the application might be. I just love the focus of that, will it make the boat go faster question.
I had a discussion last night at my own book club called the No Pressure Book Club. And one of the people in the book club was a D1 swimmer. And she was talking about how they would shave or not shave their body, essentially. And we said, does it really actually matter? And she said it does. So in roughly a 23-second swim between that and tapering, they could cut off maybe 2 seconds, which if you think about it, that's 10%. So it shows you how something so small can make such a big difference in those moments that matter. And 2 seconds is the difference of winning by far. So you'd think something like that wouldn't really matter. Now, some of that was just the mindset, which is a whole different discussion, but also it made you feel faster, but it also made you go a little faster. So it's analyzing each one of those details, I think, in our process to ask that question. I think it's a brilliant question. Will it make the boat go faster? And I think that is a really great concept. I wrote down that question just to put it on a sticky note on my computer because I think it's a good ongoing question for any business.
Yeah, like any good filter, it operates both ways. It allows us to know what passes through the filter, and it allows us to see what gets caught in it. And one of the things I really challenge a team to do once they've decided to embrace a mantra like that or a phrase like that, and then execute on it, is what did get caught in that filter? And can you ruthlessly eliminate everything that doesn't make the boat go faster? And that's a hard concept for some people to grab, because you start to find out that people have their pet projects, or the person on the team or a partner that they just like. And you get into these decisions that are really difficult. And my point isn't to make everything ultimately black and white. It's to attack the question with black and white. So when we do choose to embrace things that we know don't make the boat go faster, we now also embrace with that the ownership of that fact, which means we don't blame anyone later. We don't make excuses later. That was a choice we made. And so we use the filter to identify the black and white of it so we can have an honest discussion. On the stuff that passes through, though, that's really the exciting stuff is now we've figured out, oh, of all these things you do that you think are important, you found the true essential ingredient that we can't miss. So how do we do more of that? How do we embrace that in such a way to where it starts to become really evident in your branding? Because people would say, oh yeah, that's Catherine and that's her team. And this is what they do because they found that thing that made the boat go faster and they just embellished it. They said, okay, well then we're going to put a ton of our energy around that because it's clearly making us different. And we all need a unique value proposition in a world of commodities. So that filter becomes a two-way filter. And I want to identify both.
Absolutely. And I think another really important concept in the book was about the personalities that ended up in that boat and how the coach was switching people out to try to find the right team. We just did a podcast episode recently on hiring, and it's a little bit of that piece, but I think it's who sits where in the boat and then how that team works together. So talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what I loved about this story was it gave you a little bit of the preview before they even got to the boat of where did these young men come from and what was some of the common denominator around their storylines. And without diving too deep into the story itself, because I want to encourage everybody, go read the book or at least go check out the movie and maybe get excited to read the book. But what you see in these storylines of these young men who showed up at the boathouse to try to make that team before they even got situated in the boat was some of the grittiest group of young men that you could have featured in this, and they weren't privileged and they didn't come from backgrounds in which things were easy for them. And that part of their experience showed up in the way the coach could then identify who could fit where, because they had to fight through so much adversity to even be selected for that team in the first place. So it was really great to see that how we show up as teammates and how we bring the history of everything with us really does matter. And some of us might have a negative perception of our past and think, oh, well, they won't want me on this team. I didn't come from any great education, or I didn't come from any great experience, or maybe I even came from failure. Like I've screwed this up before. A great coach can recognize in a player on a team that could, based on how they handle that could in fact be the secret sauce. That could be the thing that makes them special. So don't give up hope if you're one of those players showing up for the team and thinking, I'm carrying this bag of bricks with me from my past. Let's see how those experiences from your past shape your tenacity for the opportunity in front of you. Because those boys that then got in that boat and got moved around by the coach and ultimately in that story even swapped out with the varsity team. We had a JV team and a varsity team that were competing with each other for the right to compete in some of these events, and they got swapped because he could see it wasn't about their experience as rowers. It was about the tenacity they brought into the boat and then the commitment they made to each other and the harmony they developed with each other to develop what they call in that sport swing. And once swing happens, the boat strangely starts to lift up above the water and it almost starts to glide on top of the water. And that's really an awesome metaphor for what we look for in our teams. We often say these little phrases like, let's work smarter, not harder. Easy to say. That storyline shows you, well, then what are some of the ingredients of a team that actually does that? And it's a beautiful thing.
Well, and the word that comes to mind is flow. And it almost becomes that you're one in how you're rowing. It's almost like it even though you have the power of however many people are in the boat, it's acting as almost one person because the flow is there and it just becomes automatic. And that's one thing I really took from that book is the flow, even though you have multiple people involved. And what does that flow look like in a team?
Yeah, I think the reason that probably stood out to you is that, like we've experienced in real estate and in mortgage banking, um, we often see teams in which someone is somewhat featured on that team. They're kind of the superstar. They're the ones that build the team around their personality and their brand. And this story reminded us that this team that excelled to ultimately the greatest height available in the era in which they competed. I mean, they became Olympic champions in a time in which crew was the number one sport in the world. I mean, this would have been like winning the Super Bowl. They were incredibly successful, and not one of them was a superstar. Not one of them
Mhm.
was a known athlete. They really did, in the way that you described flow. They chose instead to create capacity as a team, and they were better together than any one of them would have been had you moved them around or swapped somebody out. So that's an excellent takeaway from the story, and one that challenges us when we're building a team, because it means at some point, we have to enter these teams and build trust, and that foundation of trust starts with check your ego at the door.
So, how do teams really build on that trust once they have that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think trust is the foundation, but you can't stop there. That's the starting point. So once you establish that, you've identified the characteristics and the characters that are going to make up this team, and you have a combination of some of their skills and experience with some of their natural style and their grit and their tenacity. You then need to be able to create an atmosphere, and the book showed this very clearly, is they need to have the freedom to have healthy conflict. They need to be able to speak up and challenge each other. And we saw that in the story, how the different members of this crew team were able to really rally around a teammate, and sometimes rallying meant, spurring them on and challenging them and pushing them. Great teams know how to do that. Of course, there's a fine line there. You don't want to break someone's spirit, but often in a team environment, when that trust is there, you really do develop that confidence that you can call out someone and challenge someone and have a healthy conflict. And I find that teams that can combine those two, there's a foundation of trust with a real sense that we can have healthy conflict. Guess what? They're not afraid to ask tough questions. They're not afraid to push each other to be better or hold each other accountable to what we said we would do. And that's what I saw so clearly in that story. And it was beautiful, because once you're there, now the commitments you make to each other mean something, because we know that this isn't, some aspirational hope like, oh, I hope we can make it to the Olympics. I hope we can beat the Germans. No, it's this sense of commitment to each other first, and then to our goals second. And it all starts with trust and a healthy sense of conflict.
Yeah, that book, I loved how they were not willing to let down their team in any way, shape, or form at any moment. I think about the kid who was very sick and still got in that boat and rowed like crazy. And you just think, holy cow, that's commitment to the team. And not because he just didn't want to let everybody down. And that's so fantastic when that happens. So now that you've got the trust and the conflict, then how does that translate into the harmony and rhythm that the team develops?
Yeah, so in a crew environment, because again, the storyline serves as a great metaphor for what we try to do in the teams that we build. We say, okay, great, now we can make real commitments to each other. And you and I know this from a previous topic that we've covered in a podcast. Accountability works best when the foundation of those commitments is established first. If we don't have those commitments, now I'm holding you accountable to something that you didn't really commit to. Therefore, it's a bit of a dysfunctional relationship. Well, that doesn't sound like harmony, does it? That doesn't sound like flow as you described it earlier. So I think the way that you harmonize and develop that rhythm and that routine to where things really do flow has to come from the level of commitments that we make to each other, and allows for us to have some adversity, like a team member getting sick. And it was beautiful to see not just how he dived into that opportunity, but how they came around him and met him there. Like, it was a mutual relationship. It was honest commitment, and look at my hands. I mean, that's harmony. That's what happened. So how do you do that? I think you have to build these things carefully. You can't skip to one. You can't jump to artificial harmony, because when you do, that's when everybody's tiptoeing around each other because they don't want to ask the tough question, or they don't want to deal with the argument that might follow. You can't skip to those things. You can't get to accountability without commitments, and you can't get to commitments without that safety of knowing we can have a healthy conflict, and all that works with trust. It sounds like I'm working through our old friend Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions. I guess that shows how embedded his model is in my brain, and that's the parallel I see with this story. Was that book showed a story in real life of what his model looks like in theory played out. So I love when that happens, because that shows me that that's not just a theory. There's some truth to it. And secondly, this story in particular was incredibly inspiring. So you add that ingredient to it, and it's a great story to share, not just with your team, but your kids, other friends and family members. And I think that's why it got popularized into a movie. It's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, and it's a true story. It's not a parable, it's a true story, which is great because I feel like that tied me in more to the outcome of the book. So, and one of the things I really loved that I think we really need to talk about is the equipment. So they talked a lot about the building of the boats and how much care and love went into that, and different teams and different boats and adjusting the boats. And I think that equipment, which can be is just a symbol for lots of things in our industry, is so important. So kind of let's talk about that a little bit in their boat and how that relates to everything else in our business.
Yeah, that is a great reminder that no matter how much we've talked about in terms of the people and how much we might have touched on in terms of the process, at some point, what you're calling equipment is really another fundamental ingredient when you're a high performance team. And so it's very simple. Any of us can go out to the local putt putt range and pick up any old putter they hand us and go out and have some fun with our friends at a goofy golf adventure. But at some point, if you're going to play golf and you're going to play in tournaments and you're going to compete for dollars and rankings and ultimately to be a professional, equipment becomes a key ingredient to your success. So in this story, what we saw back at the boathouse at the University of Washington was this really interesting character who pretty much hung out there all the time and allowed one of the young men on the team to help develop the boat that they would ultimately take to compete with. And I think what happened in that moment was they realized that equipment was not just the type of wood that was used or the type of shape that it was given or the type of finish that was on it, although all those things mattered. There was something about the tactical handcrafting of it that allowed them to, again, bring that harmony, bring the equipment into that harmony as well. It was as much of a part of them as the people themselves. And, we don't need to get nerdy about crew as a sport, because I know there's somebody listening who knows way more about it than the two of us do. I think what we really found was exciting was just seeing how critical of a part it really plays. So you can't discount it. You can't say, oh, we can go do this with, any old canoe or kayak. No, that's a very specific watercraft designed for a very specific number of people to sit at a very specific distance so that their paddles and oars have a very specific cadence. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. And isn't that just like what we see in business? We often need certain tools in order to succeed, and they are precise. They're not just random. We don't pick them up, off the discard pile. They're honed to perfection, and I see that in our process and in our ultimate technology. So those are examples of our modern equipment that we might be using in a work environment. But agreed, I don't think we can ever discount in a high performance team how critical equipment is to our success.
I think that you could have a perfect team, but if you didn't have, let's say they just had a rowboat, they're never going to win, right? So it's the combination of the two that is the key. And I was surprised how much I enjoyed reading about the equipment in the book, is just you really felt the very detail and how important the detail is. And I think that that was also key, not only the detail with the people, but the detail with the equipment, the detail with the coach, all the pieces and parts that come together, the food, how they slept, how warm they were, all of those things make a difference at the end of the day. Those small details do matter.
So if you think about that in the application of the world we live in, that's a reminder that as a team leader, you have to be aware of all of those things in order to get the most out of your team. We're not all competing for an Olympic championship, but we often do compete for things like top producer or to be recognized as a national top producer, whether we're in real estate or lending for the audience here, but probably others of you that are listening that might not know anything about real estate. You're looking to be a leader or an expert in whatever world your small business operates in. And I think what you touched on there, Catherine, is really important, is to realize that all of the small things we do add up to the big results we get. So in our world, some of that is how we show up. How rested are we? How much energy do we have? Are we eating well? Are we exercising? How is our mindset? We talk about all these topics because just like we see in that story, they're just like what you said. They are the ingredients to that success formula. And we have to extract those from a story and say, okay, what are our ingredients? And are we clear on those things that we're going to choose to do, because every small decision adds up to the total that we're going to measure in the end.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, this book is so good. Okay, so has there been a time that you've really experienced that lift or that flow that we were talking about earlier, where you're kind of above the water cruising?
Yeah, it's great. I can think of a couple of examples, both personally and professionally. So we'll stay in the lane of with our teams. One was early on in my mortgage lending career. I was intrigued by what I saw maybe on the real estate side of the world, a little bit ahead of us. Groups like Keller Williams had figured out how to build teams where not everybody was trying to replicate the same thing. They actually created a team in which those different roles that were defined were designed to create more effectiveness and efficiency and capacity. And I was intrigued by that and thought, why aren't we doing that in mortgage lending? Why is everything a loan officer and a processor? Like, why aren't we building out more diversity in our team? And so the flow and that swing really happened with our team when we identified how to let go of certain pieces of our role that maybe we were good at, but they weren't our unique ability. And we had to identify, based on our unique abilities, how could I combine mine with yours and then hire for a couple of more and increase the overall experience for everyone, whether it's for us internally or for our partners or for our customers. How could we give them a better version of everything because we chose to stay within the lane of our unique ability? And it was a lot like sitting in the seats in that boat. Was I don't need to be in a single man kayak out there. I really do need some teammates in that boat with me. And I need to trust that as I swing and oar in my direction, they're doing the same in the seat in front of me and in back of me. And that's when I felt it most, was when we first embraced that. And we felt a little bit like pioneers at the time. We couldn't find a lot of other lenders. Our bank couldn't understand how we were going to, like, whose name is this all going to go under? Well, when you guys win an award, who gets to go to the award trip? This was how clunky it was for them at the time, because we just were trying something that didn't exist 20 years ago. Today, it looks really normal. By the way, I'm taking no credit for creating that concept. It just, at the time, we looked around and couldn't find a lot of really great examples of that. The closest we found were, again, a few of these, like, I don't know, superstar producers who would just hide everybody like minions behind them. You didn't really know who they were. Where we chose to highlight everybody. No, you wanted the best of the best. We've created a team. It's like an all-star team. That's when I really felt the swing.
Got it. Yeah. And interestingly enough, I felt like we had a really good flow in the craziness of 2020. And part of it was that you had to trust people. And I think that's another good concept from the book, is that's when they really broke through, is when they made that decision to trust, because we didn't have another choice, right? You couldn't have people out of their lane because they didn't have time to go out of their lane. So it was a really great accidental experiment in people staying in their lanes and having very defined roles because they were very busy doing those roles. And it
Mm.
showed how much you could accomplish when everybody has those defined roles, stays in them, and trusts everybody else to do their part. Because you think about how much execution we had during those times in 2020, 2021, and how much we accomplished. And I think that's part of it, is that you had to trust and you had to get your stuff done and you had to stay in your lane. And it showed the productivity that can really happen if you've got that group that's really doing that. And I think the lack of time actually helps solidify that a little bit, if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense. And I'm so glad you touched on that example, because I think some of our listeners, now a few years down the road, having experienced the incredible high of that productivity and now having shifted through some of the lower productivity seasons that they've experienced, maybe they've forgotten that maybe neither of those are really the definition of who we are as a team, but maybe reality is somewhere in between. And so we shouldn't throw away those highs and lows. We should learn from them. And one of the things I hear people say now is, I guess we weren't really that good in 2020 and 2021 because everything was easy, everything came to us. And I suppose if all you're looking at is lead generation, that's maybe a fair statement. But you touched on it accurately by saying, but what we learned how to do was execute at an incredibly high level. We actually had to manage all those leads. We had to convert all those leads. We had to close all those loans. That showed us how to operate at a level of efficiency like we've never seen before. And it showed us what's possible. And again, if we want to tie out to the story, I think that's a little bit how some of those young men felt as they competed in the races leading up to the Olympics. Was all of a sudden it was, oh my gosh, we can do this. We do have the ability. We're not just the JV team from some outpost in Washington State. We can compete with the Ivy League and we can compete with the world. So I'm so glad you shared that example from your past, because I think some of us need to realize we're probably not as bad as we think we are. We're probably not as great as we think we are. But if we can find somewhere in between and draw lessons from both, it's very possible that we just keep getting better.
Yes, absolutely. So this is such a good story. How would you spread the word, share it with your team, incorporate it into your team on a daily basis?
Well, a lot of times what I find is teams get stuck in their own little world. They get stuck in this thought that is somewhat of a, yeah, we've tried that before. Yeah, we've done that, or we already know that. And so you start to live in this world where we do things the way we do things because it's the way we do things. And there's not really a good outside camera angle into what we do to challenge what we do. And by the way, often it works, meaning it's not like it's fallen apart.
Mhm.
It's just not optimized. So I find a story like this becomes a really safe way to introduce a team to what's possible without a direct indictment on anything they're currently doing. We don't have to directly talk about you, your role, the flow, the process of your team. We can just read a story about it, and then we can ask for application later. And that's what I really love about the way you introduced an episode called Book Club. Is I think that's what our audience is going to enjoy as we do this in the future. Is it's less about, hey, what was the book about? What did the author write about? And what were the characters that we all can already read in the story if we'll read it ourselves? It's what can we draw out of that and plug into our own environment. So the reason I do like referring this to clients and to team members is I want to give them the opportunity to be more curious and to think. And I find sometimes a story opens up neural pathways in which you're willing to suspend your judgment on a topic and just listen and just enjoy. And guess what starts to happen? You start to think, huh, I wonder if we tried that. I wonder what that would look like if we did that. And once you've given yourself permission to be curious, now as a coach, I can help facilitate the what's next. What do we do with that? And how do we optimize that in a way to where it becomes now a new part of your team's culture? So yeah, this is a great story. And I hope we'll do this again on a podcast book club topic in the future.
Absolutely. I love books, and it's fun to dive into something and learn lessons from it in a different way. And this was probably one of the most enjoyable books on business that I've read, just because it was a fun story that kept me engaged. I think I read it in a weekend. So it wasn't a difficult read by any way, shape, or form. So I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to, and have a great story that's also applicable to business and life.
Excellent way to tie it up, Catherine. Let's do a book club again very soon.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we're going to sign off. Thanks so much for being here. Find us on Instagram, YouTube, and you can also find us individually. Please let us know if there's a future book that you want us to cover or talk about or read together. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for listening. This is Building Bigger Lives. Look for podcasts regularly on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Instagram at Building Bigger Lives. Thank you for listening. We are so appreciative of your support. This episode was edited and produced by Scott Higby at Studio C. Support also provided by Building Champions.